Welcome to the Analysis.news podcast. I'm your guest host, Greg Wilpert. On Thursday, February 4th, President Joe Biden announced that the United States will withdraw its support for Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen. The announcement comes 5 years after the Obama administration began supporting the effort, which was continued throughout the Trump administration. The war in Yemen, led by Saudi Arabia in coalition with 8 other Arab states, represents the world's most serious humanitarian crisis according to the United Nations. So far, the war has caused 233,000 deaths, most of them from indirect causes such as lack of access to food, health services, and infrastructure. 24 million Yemenis depend on food assistance. The U.S. supported the effort by supplying Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates with tens of billions of dollars in advanced weaponry, mid-air refueling capacity, and bomb targeting. The outgoing Trump administration made the situation even worse when it declared the government in Yemen to be a foreign terrorist organization, a declaration that took effect only one day before Biden's inauguration. I conducted the following interview with Hassan el Tayyab a few days before the Biden administration announced the withdrawal of U.S. support for the war effort. Even though the announcement will significantly change the course of the war, I believe that the issues we discuss in this interview, such as the sanctions, the Foreign Terrorist Organization designation, and the importance of a new War Powers Act resolution, are still valid. Hassan is the legislative manager for Middle East policy at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, which has been spearheading the effort for Congress to invoke a War Powers Act resolution with regard to the U.S. support for the war in Yemen. Thanks for joining me, Hassan.
Thanks so much for having me, Greg.
So before we get into the latest developments, let's go over what's brought us here so far. That is, with regard to the war in Yemen. Briefly, what's the U.S. involvement been like, and what has Congress done, and how did all of this get started?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a really horrible thing that's going on in Yemen right now. It's the world's worst humanitarian crisis on the planet, and what the UN considers the worst place in the world to be a child. This started in 2011 when the Arab Spring spread all over the Middle East, including Yemen, and the people nonviolently ousted the then president / dictator, President Saleh. And Saleh, was allowed to stay in Yemen and move around freely, and they appointed Hadi to be the interim president as they moved to a more representative form of government. It's kind of complex. There was corruption charges. There was still, a lot of poverty. And the Houthis rose up and ousted President Hadi with the help of the former President Saleh. And then Hadi fled to Riyadh, asked for military support, and thus the Saudi coalition was formed. And the U.S. said that they would supply weapons, military support, hardware, spare parts transfers, targeting assistance, logistical support for Saudi airstrikes, and the war began in March 2015 with U.S. backing. Saudi Arabia put a full air, land, and sea blockade around the entire country. There were airstrikes on civilian targets, hospitals, weddings, schools, funerals. And tens of thousands of people have been killed. Innocent people have been killed in Houthi-held territory and beyond. The blockade has just really slowly starved the entire population. And now, after 6 years of fighting, there's 16 million people on the brink of famine, 3 million cases of cholera. COVID-19 is wreaking havoc on the country, and again, this is all being done with U.S. military support. There have been several efforts to stop U.S. participation in the war, and they were spearheaded in the Senate in 2018 by Senator Sanders. We were able to get one of those. The first Yemen War Powers resolution was able to pass, SJ Res 54, and that made some progress on the ground in Yemen with regards to the Hodeidah ceasefire, and it helped usher in a ceasefire in Yemen's largest port. Congress forced more votes. They passed in bicameral, bipartisan majorities, SJ Res 7 in April 2019. Trump ultimately vetoed that bill, and the U.S. support for the war continued. There were also, emergency weapon sales in 2019 that Trump was trying to push through to support Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates in their, munitions and, just hardware that they need to keep the war going. And Congress had a hold on them, but Trump invoked these emergency powers and was able to push through billions in weapon sales. And unfortunately, the war just has continued and raged on. Like you said, Pompeo, to make matters even worse, during this global pandemic where the administration has kept military support for the war going and even cut off humanitarian funding to large parts of Yemen where the Houthi-controlled territory where 80% of the population lives. They put in place this FTO, or Foreign Terrorist Organization designation. And it's deeply problematic. One, there's no real justification. I mean, this isn't just a small group. This is a movement in Yemen that has basically, captured territory and, occupying territory that controls humanitarian aid to millions and millions of people. Over 20 million people live in these areas, and the FTO designation, as the Trump administration is outgoing, everything was so chaotic as we can recall with January 6th, and they tried to make life as complicated for the incoming Biden administration as possible. And one of those really, terrible, complicated things that they did was imposing this FTO designation, which basically would cut off any humanitarian's ability to do transactions in Yemen, or face legal penalty, or financial or prison. And so that's deeply troubling. Also, it would put any UN negotiators at risk for even talking to the Houthi leadership and trying to broker a ceasefire deal, which we all know is absolutely critical. And last but not least, I just think it's pretty ironic that Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who are actually transferring U.S.-made weapons to groups like Al-Qaeda, Arabian Peninsula, there's no question of whether or not they should be labeled, but we're going to label the Houthis. So I think, again, this is just making a complex situation even more complex. There's been almost unanimous consent that this is a bad idea among humanitarians and among diplomats at the UN. Former career civil servants and even bipartisan members of Congress have said this is just a terrible idea. It needs to be reversed. Forgive me, I know I'm going on here, but one thing I will mention is that the Biden administration, they did something pretty important at the beginning of, right at the beginning of their administration, and they put a pause on sanctions on the Houthis. And so that's promising as they go to review whether or not they're going to lift the designation or not. And they said they would pause it for 30 days. Unfortunately, the UN is still claiming that despite the pause in sanctions, financiers and humanitarians are still feeling like it's a risk to do their important work and to get aid to so many people in Yemen, because if you have to do ramp up a lot of humanitarian aid delivery, if you don't know if you're going to be penalized for that in a month's time, that really restricts your ability to make plans and really makes you rethink doing humanitarian trade in Yemen. So absolutely, we need to end support for the war and weapon sales for the war and lift this FTO designation, among many other things we need to do.
But what about the claim that I guess both the Trump administration have been made and in other occasions have been made that the sanctions, which also includes the FTO designation, makes exceptions for food and medical deliveries, basically for humanitarian aid?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. But the problem is there are already so many risks to doing business in Yemen or to doing any transactions in Yemen. Because of the violence, because of the blockade, UN-approved ships get stopped in Hodeidah Harbor by the Saudi blockade and are unable to even get in. And oftentimes we've seen food and food rot in these ships as it's waiting to get offloaded. And, if you got millions of people living on the brink of famine and 50,000 people, according to the UN, actually living in a famine, that makes it a lot more challenging and more difficult. So if you add in the blockade, if you add that to the FTO designation and the fact that people can't plan ahead, it makes it really difficult to do humanitarian aid work, and that's exactly why we need to lift this terrible, disastrous FTO designation immediately.
Now, Biden and also his newly minted Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, have on various occasions actually expressed their opposition to U.S. support for Saudi Arabia in this war. Now, Biden has passed something like 40 executive orders since taking office almost 2 weeks ago. And but Yemen hasn't been among them, except for perhaps what you said earlier about this review, but or this hold on sanctions. But what can, in total, I mean, you mentioned already, of course, the FTO designation, but what else can Biden do right now to stop the U.S. support for this effort, for this war in Yemen?
Okay, great question. That's the most important question we have so far, right? What have they done and what can they do? They did put a pause on the sanctions for 30 days. That was good. They need to lift the FTO designation. The second thing is they actually put a freeze on new weapon sales to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, which is a good start. I mean, that we didn't have a freeze during the Trump years, so it's good that's in place. That said, they haven't actually blocked delivery or said no, we're not going to be selling any more weapons to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So we definitely need that. We also need them to end support for the war, to sign an executive order and say that we're no longer going to be doing targeting assistance for coalition airstrikes. We're not going to be doing any logistical support. We're not going to be doing intel sharing. We're not going to be doing spare parts transfers for all the hardware that goes into keeping these warplanes in the air. Another thing that we need to do is lift the suspension on humanitarian aid, and not just lift the suspension, but because the Trump administration, they cut all sorts of funding to the UN, WHO, WFP, and 75% of Yemen's humanitarian aid work essentially got cut by the administration. And they also suspended $73 million of USAID funding in March of 2020. So we need to, end the suspension and get aid going to all parts of Yemen. But we also need to expand humanitarian aid and pressure other parties in the international community to expand their aid using diplomacy. And Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, they have, the UAE, it's worth noting, they pledged nothing last year and gave nothing, even though they are a main contributor of the violence in Yemen. So those are all really important things. And I also think we need to get the administration to call on Saudi Arabia to end the blockade, because that is a massive killer in Yemen, cutting off the flow of food, fuel, medicine, clean water, humanitarian assistance, vaccines, you name it. We need to end the blockade. One thing I did think it's important to mention is that the administration has a role to play, but Congress also has a role to play. And like you said at the top of this segment, we're supporting and supportive of doing another Yemen War Powers resolution and getting Biden to sign it. So Representative Ro Khanna has made it pretty clear that he intends to introduce another Yemen War Powers resolution, and he says that Senator Sanders is considering supporting as well. So everything we can do in the grassroots is to get these members to introduce these War Powers resolutions, make sure that the Congress is on board, and force a vote and have Biden be the first president in U.S. history since the original passage of the 1973 War Powers Act, have him be the first president to sign a War Powers into law.
Why do you think it would be so important, let's say, if he does act, to still have this War Powers resolution to pass and have him sign it?
Yeah, absolutely. I get that question a lot. People are like, well, we should just let Biden do his thing. It's going to... it's early on. He's already done all these executive orders. Let's just give him the opportunity to do it. And I think one, we have to remember we lived through 4 years of a rogue executive with no respect for Article One powers or the Congress at all. I mean, as far as from my vantage point here in Washington D.C., it didn't seem like the president really cared that bipartisan, bicameral majorities. A lot of people in his own party said that the war in Yemen should end, and Article One, Section 8 of the Constitution says that only Congress can declare war. And so the war was never authorized. Congress, with majorities in both chambers, said they wanted to end it, couldn't do it. If we get Biden to sign this into law, it'll be the first time that this has happened, and it'll establish a really important constitutional precedent that war powers resolutions are, in fact, the law of the land. They're constitutionally supported by the executive. So that's one. The next thing is that executive orders can be torn up by another president, and we want to make sure that no president can just start U.S. military support for another Saudi intervention or UAE intervention in Yemen. And I mean, that's critical. We just don't know what's going to happen in 4 years, and we don't know how the Yemen war is going to play out. So we have to get this into law and not just be an executive order. That can be torn up. Last but not least, UN Special Envoy to Yemen, Martin Griffiths, he's trying to negotiate a ceasefire in Yemen. And I think having Biden with bipartisan majorities in Congress backing him up on that, and saying, that's leverage that Martin Griffiths can use in negotiations with Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the Houthis and the STC and the Hadi government to finally get a ceasefire deal. And I think, having that signed into law and not just be an executive order is going to give us a lot of leverage to draw down the violence.
Well, that was actually going to be my next question, which is that, I mean, if the U.S. were to end its support for the Yemen war, what would it mean actually for Saudi Arabia's effort to continue? You already basically answered that, but I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about that. I mean, what would be the next step? A ceasefire? Would they actually agree to that? Do you think? And then, of course, beyond that, what does that mean for Yemen?
So I think you bring up a good point, and I think it is important to mention that, if the U.S. ends our military participation in the war, it's going to be very difficult for the Saudi-led coalition to keep airstrikes going. I mean, if we end some of the participation and not all of it, that's a different story. But if we absolutely cut off, all the things I mentioned, the targeting assistance, the spare parts transfers that actually keep the warplanes in the air, like every time an F-15 or an F-16 lands, the tires almost have to be replaced every time. And you can't just go to Walmart to get these things. You have to go to U.S. contractors, and without that flow of spare parts, it's going to be really difficult. And it's not like China or Russia can just swoop in and completely replace all this U.S. hardware in a short period of time. So Saudi Arabia is kind of stuck with U.S. hardware for a while. We have a lot of leverage here. So one, I think it's going to grind the airstrikes to a halt. I think it's going to be really difficult for them to keep the blockade going and put them in a position where I think they're more likely to agree to a peace process and a negotiated settlement that's ultimately needed, and stop using this moral authority that the United States is essentially giving the coalition to wreak havoc on school children and innocent civilians all over Yemen who are starving to death. And so, we've got a lot of leverage, and cutting off military support, I think, is one of many things we need to do to end this conflict.
Okay, well, before we conclude, I just want to ask one more question that goes a little bit beyond the issue of Yemen specifically. That is, the U.S. has in recent years really perfected the use of sanctions as a way of conducting war without a declaration of war and without actually dropping any bombs, but still killing tens of thousands of civilians in several different countries. I mean, there's something like 24 countries that are currently being sanctioned by the U.S. to varying degrees, and some of them in very extremely. I mean, Yemen, of course, is one of the worst examples, but there are certainly others such as Venezuela and Iran at the moment. Now, Representative Ilhan Omar of Minnesota has recognized the danger that such unilateral presidential power represents, and has introduced a bill to basically require a kind of war powers resolution to enforce or to impose sanctions that is with the approval of that it would only happen with the approval of Congress. What do you think of that proposal, and what else do you think needs to be done on a legislative level to deal with the president's or the executive's ability to wage war?
Yeah, and lift sanctions and impose sanctions. This is such a big issue. Sanctions are basically another form of warfare and are killing millions, or I shouldn't say killing millions, but impacting and creating a humanitarian crisis for millions of people all over the planet. And you'd look at Iran. They don't have access to PPE, testing kits, respirators, sanitizer in the way that they should. And Iranian nurses right now are dying at higher rates than other healthcare professionals around the world. And it's really resulting in the spread of COVID-19. And everybody knows that COVID-19 anywhere is a threat to everybody everywhere because, it's not, the virus can spread, the virus can mutate. So we really have to think about sanctions in a whole new way, especially during this global pandemic. Now, Representative Ilhan Omar's bill, I think, is a really good step in the right direction because it requires Congress to basically, approve of new sanctions. And so the executive branch, the burden of proof would be on the executive branch and to say why this is important for us to do for our national security. And it really creates this other step for Congress to have oversight over the executive branch. And I think that's just really important. There are lots of things we can do. A lot of them, unfortunately, has to happen at the executive level. Things like organizations like OFAC or the Treasury, Commerce. They've just made this policy of putting sanctions, allowing sanctions in all these countries for questionable gains and foreign policy gains. So I think Ilhan Omar's is exactly the right direction. I also think we need an emergency general license that's worldwide that covers every sanctioned country and location on Earth to allow any coronavirus-related support to healthcare professionals around the world, including the vaccine, PPE, testing kits, respirators, sanitizer. So that's bottom line. We should really consider lifting sanctions, economic sanctions during this pandemic, just to make sure that, countries like Iran and Venezuela and Cuba have the resources they need to purchase all of this really important equipment, and so that more and more people don't fall into poverty. Another thing that I think that I've started to discuss with people on the Hill is the idea of also flipping the script, not just on sanctions, but on FTO designations, because right now...
Foreign terrorist organization.
Yeah, exactly. A foreign terrorist organization. I'm an alphabet soup over here, right? And what that, right now, the executive branch, the State Department, can just say, well, see that group, we're going to label them a terrorist organization. Congress has literally 7 calendar days to pass a resolution in the House, pass it in the Senate, get it to the president's desk. That the president, because it came from their administration, would most likely veto that resolution. It would come back, and then they would need a 2/3 majority, 67 votes in the Senate to be able to beat that override, which is kind of impossible. And if you think about what this FTO designation could mean to humanitarian aid operations in Yemen, in this Houthi-held territory, it's devastating. I mean, the UN thinks that this could plunge 5 million people into famine. I mean, that kind of power is it's just, one executive branch, can make that decision unilaterally. That's really troubling. So I was thinking it might be good to also flip the script on FTO designations and require, a longer period for Congress to review before it comes into effect. At least 30 to maybe 90 days, and also require a congressional approval to have an FTO come into being and put the burden of proof on the executive branch. So that's another policy solution among many that we need.
Well, sounds good. Well, we've covered a lot. I think we're going to leave it there. I was speaking to Hassan el Tayyab, Legislative Manager for Middle East Policy at the Friends Committee on National Legislation. Thanks again, Hassan, for having joined me today.
Thank you so much, Greg.
And thanks to our listeners for tuning in to theAnalysis.news. If you like programs such as this one, please visit our website and make a donation to The Analysis so we can keep doing this.